joining you today on Tide. So welcome, get ready for science and tides. All right, so today we're talking about tides, which are the change in sea level. Now, many of you probably have thought that the moon has something to do with the ocean. So when we talked about waves or we talked about currents, you thought, ooh, maybe that's the moon working on it. But not quite. The moon's a little different. The moon creates what we call tides. So tides are the change in sea level. So the sea level rises or the sea level falls, and it depends on where you are. It's caused by the gravity of the moon. And as we know, the Earth spins once a day, so once every 24 hours. But if you also remember that the moon also revolves around the Earth as well. So if you were to go out tonight and look at where the moon is in the sky directly at midnight, and you waited 24 hours, and tomorrow night, directly at midnight, you went up and looked at the sky, the moon will have shifted. Not a lot, just a little bit, but it will have shifted. So because it's not exactly 24 hours, the tide, your high tide, the high tide, the high tide, your different high tides vary a little bit each day. They're about 50 minutes later. So if it's high tide today is at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, tomorrow it will be at 3:50. And the next day it'll be at 4:40. And the next day at 5:30 and so forth and so forth. So we see here we have two pictures of the exact same dock. One is at low tide, the other one's at high tide. And you can see that there's a massive difference, close to 18 feet if we're kind of judging based off the people in the picture. But that's what we call the tidal range. The tidal range is your difference in elevation between your high tide and your low tide. And on this dock, or in this picture, it's probably around 15 to 20 feet or so. In Bay of Fundy, Canada, it's a very large difference as well, as you can see from the boat pictures. 8, 9, 10 feet difference between your highs and lows. So in this picture, you may notice that people wouldn't just keep their boats in the mud for no reason. So what happens is during low tide, the oceans recede and the boats are trapped. So when first start learning how to sail or first buy a boat, the most important thing is understanding the tides, because if you have a dock that you can't get to, you're stuck an entire half day out in the ocean, and that's something you don't want to do. So making sure that you understand how tides work is of the utmost importance for any sailors. So we have high tide again, and then low tide again. Large difference. All right, so we said that the tides are caused by the moon's gravity. Well, the moon's a large object and it's far from us, but it still has a pretty big gravitational pull. Well, in that scenario, we can also think of the sun. The sun's a very, very large object and it's very far away of us, but it too has a gravitational pull. So when the moon and the sun line up in a straight line with the Earth, we get something known as a spring tide. You have this super strong gravitational pull and your high tides become much higher. Well, if your high tides are higher, they're taking water away from somewhere else, which must mean that your low tides are lower. So when all three, moon, earth, and sun, are lined up in a straight line, and that could be at a full moon or a new moon, you get a spring tide, which is high highs and low lows. Well, the opposite of a spring tide is a neap tide. So instead of being in a straight line, they're at a right angle to each other. So the Earth's at a right angle between the moon and the sun, and this occurs during a first and third quarter. So now they're kind of acting in opposite forces. The moon's pulling in one direction, the sun's pulling in another direction. So your high tides aren't nearly as high now, and your low tides aren't nearly as low. So for a neap tide, you have lower high tides and higher low tides. So your spring tides again, when they're all lined up in a straight line, it becomes very high tides, can cause them up to raise as much 15 meters. That's an incredibly large difference between your highs and lows. And this occurs around every 2 weeks. You know, it takes a month for the moon to go around the Earth. You have one full moon and one new moon every month, so twice a month, so every 2 weeks. And this is when you have your greatest daily tidal range. So the greatest difference between your highs and lows. Once again, the neap tides are the opposite. So your highs aren't nearly as high, your lows aren't nearly as low. And once again, this also occurs around twice a month. And this has your smallest daily tidal range, so the smallest difference between your highs and your lows. All right, so we see a road at high tide can, especially in storm season, can cause a lot of flooding. So Hurricane Sandy, when it struck New York City, one of the main reasons it did so much damage was because of the spring tide that was going on. So because it was a spring tide, the high tides were higher than usual, which meant it was much easier for water to flood into the city. Okay. So when we talk about our tides, the number of high and lows you get every single day kind of differs depending on where you are. So we have a term, diurnal. Diurnal means daily. So in a diurnal tide, you have one full tidal cycle each day, daily. So you have one high tide and one low tide. Now, if you live on the East Coast, like we do, you actually have a semi-diurnal tide. So semi means half, diurnal, once again, daily. So half day. So in a semi-diurnal tide, you have a tidal cycle every half day. So you have 2 highs and 2 lows in every full day. So diurnal is 1 high, 1 low a day. Semi-diurnal is 2 highs and 2 lows. And that's what we would have here on the East Coast, over by Wilmington or Myrtle Beach or the other things. So you can see the places in red are your semi-diurnal tides, and the places in yellow are your diurnal tides. So between your high and low tide, you have something known as a flood tide. So a flood tide is when your high tide is coming in, so the water is increasing, right? This is when you're at the beach and you're sitting in your lawn chairs, and every 10, 20 minutes or so, you got to move your chair up a little bit because your towel keeps getting wet. So that's a flood tide. An ebb tide is the opposite. So you're sitting there and your feet are in the water, and now the ocean's going out. So you got to keep moving your chair down through the ocean to keep your feet wet. So an ebb tide is between a high and low, and a flood tide is between a low and a high. And then the slack water is when it's neither coming nor going, it's just kind of stagnant for a bit before you have either an advance or a retreat. And lastly, we have something known as a tidal bore. So at a high tide, if you live over near an estuary or a river or somewhat, you'll notice that rivers flow into the ocean. Duh, Mr. Kolb, I already knew that. But a tidal bore is when you have a rush of water upstream caused by a high tide. So at high tide, ocean levels rise. Some water can rush upstream a little bit and create something as we call a tidal bore. And so you see here in the picture of San Francisco, the tidal bore is pushing the boats or kind of keeping the boats from going out to ocean. Here's another picture of a tidal bore as the water comes up the river, and then once again. And one guy surfing the tidal bore. Look at those guys, looking like they're having fun. Well, thank you very much for your time. I hope you have a wonderful class, and I will see you next time. Have a wonderful day.